Welcome to the WP Builds podcast, bringing you the latest news from the WordPress community. Now, welcome your hosts, David Waumsley and Nathan Wrigley.
Hello there and welcome to the WP Builds podcast once again. This is episode number 216, entitled D is for Database. It was published on Thursday, the 11th of February, 2021. My name's Nathan Wrigley and I'll be joined in a few moments by my good friend David Waumsley so that we can have our database discussion. But just before that, a couple of bits of housekeeping. WP Builds produces quite a bit of WordPress content each week. We do a podcast on a Thursday, that's what you're listening to now, and we do This Week in WordPress, a roundup of the WordPress news. It's kind of like a newsletter mixed with a live show with some notable WordPress guests. If you want to join us for that, you can go to wpbuilds.com/live or join us in the Facebook group, wpbuilds.com/Facebook at 2 p.m. UK time. Join in the comments, it's a very lively and interesting discussion, and we do it every single week. If you do want to stay up to date with all of that content, head over to wpbuilds.com/subscribe and sign up on the forums, join the Facebook group, bookmark the YouTube channel, and so on. Another page is wpbuilds.com/deals. It's a searchable, filterable list of deals in the WordPress space, significant amounts off, lots and lots of plugins, and those deals never seem to go away. wpbuilds.com/deals. And lastly, if you would like to advertise your product or service in front of a WordPress-specific audience, head over to wpbuilds.com/advertise. A bit like A/B split test did. Do you want to set up your A/B split test in record time, like in a couple of minutes? Use your existing pages and test anything against anything else. Buttons, images, headers, rows, anything. And the best part is that it works with Elementor, Beaver Builder, and the WordPress block editor. You can check it out and get a free demo at absplittest.com. Okay, let's get stuck into the main portion of the podcast. David Waumsley and I having a chat about databases. Now, before we begin, I think we should make it very clear that both David and I would kind of rather that databases didn't exist. We've spent most of our life in the WordPress space trying to pretend it's not there, trying to avoid it. But it's not possible. Without a database, your WordPress website would literally do nothing. So it's an important thing. However, there's a lot of tools out there which can help you interact with it, see what's in there, and help clean it up. So the debate ranges quite broadly, actually. We cover a lot of ground, but obviously, I think it's fair to say that we probably put our foot in it from time to time. If we do, let us know in the show notes. Perhaps you can find the show notes on the podcast website or in the Facebook group. I hope that you enjoy the podcast.
Hello, it's the fourth in our series of chats called the A-Z of WordPress, where we attempt to cover all the major aspects of building and maintaining sites with WordPress. Today, we're going to really set pulses racing with the letter D, which stands for database.
I don't know whose pulses are going to be racing for this, but there you go.
I know. Just the word sounds so incredibly dull. That certainly for me, for years of using WordPress, I just pretended the database didn't exist. It was this little cylinder thing that, as the icons show us, that just happened to do magic in the background, and they just avoided it at all costs.
You know what? I think that's a really normal thing, because if you think about WordPress, you just sort of think about the visual aspects to it. You know, you think about the UI and the theme and the content that you're putting in and the text that you're writing and the images that you're uploading. And really, if you were a cursory user of WordPress, it would be entirely understandable if you never knew there was such a thing as a database. You know, if you were to ask somebody who just is a consumer of WordPress and doesn't really have any technical insight into it, and you ask them, where's the data stored? They probably just sort of say, well, it's in WordPress, isn't it? And, well, okay, what does that mean? Well, it's on my website. It's in WordPress. Yeah. And I have to say, this is not an area where I feel in any way an expert. This is something that I have largely ignored. The beauty of solutions like WordPress is the fact that it is very possible to not get too involved in the database and manage to use it quite successfully. But I know that you're more adept than I am, but I don't think you would claim to be an expert either, would you?
No way. I still really don't understand the basics, and I don't like to fiddle around with the database, but I have come to appreciate how useful it is to have some knowledge about it, or to even figure the fact that it's there when you're building your sites, because it makes knowing something about it makes such a difference to the general health and the speed of your site that it's something that I can't ignore any longer. So we could talk a little bit. I mean, do you have any database horror stories?
I really don't. The only sort of connection that I've got with databases is when I was learning PHP right at the beginning. And again, I would stress that I never really went enormously far down that journey. But, 20 years ago, I don't know what the number is, but a number of years ago, you get those PHP primer books and you go through and you get the basic instructions of how to do simple commands. And then chapter 2 or 3 is, an introduction to the database. And so that's where I went. And so that's really my understanding of it. But to say that I've had a dilemma or a drama with the database, no, I really can't put my finger on anything where something has gone catastrophically wrong. Now, it may be that the database was behind certain problems and a simple backup restore has fixed that problem for me. I'm not entirely sure, but no. And I would just sort of add that maybe that is the point of systems like WordPress, really, is to abstract the boring, difficult, perhaps potentially uninteresting bits of creating dynamic websites with a CMS like WordPress, is to just sort of abstract that and take the database problems away to make it so that you really don't have to have that technical understanding. You can just type, drag in an image, click save or publish, and you're done. And I would be very, very sure to say that the majority of people using WordPress have no experience using a database at all. So no horror stories. Go on. You must have one.
Well, a few, and I didn't, unlike you, I didn't read any books in the first place. I mean, I literally have only needed to worry about databases because of some issues. And one of them was quite recent, within the last year perhaps, where I had a multi-site which I put out, which it spun out different versions of a site for people who wanted to test stuff with Beaver Builder.
Oh, okay, right.
And I was wondering what was happening on my server because it was getting full, and I was thinking it just can't be. And it turned out there was 20 gigabytes in this one multi-site which had been used because it hadn't cleared itself up. So that was an instant where I suddenly had to work out how to clear up a database because it was just so big and it was getting so slow. But even going further back, I guess the first time I felt I needed to understand a little bit was because the only site really that got hacked was one when, before I started doing this as a profession, I ran this shop and it got hacked. And they clearly, I couldn't clear up the files. Clearly they'd done stuff to the database because they just kept gaining access all the time. So it's really, the only reason I've come to appreciate databases is because of issues. And I've got another one as well going on at the moment, which is I use Server Pilot to manage our servers, which are DigitalOcean. Mm-hmm. And interestingly there, I've got an issue that the database is not up to date with what it really should be for WordPress now. And their advice on Server Pilot is to, unless you really need to, don't update. Yeah, so it's not a one-click solution. You have to run some commands to do things. So so these things have intruded on me, really. That's kind of my stories with things. I've had to kind of get involved with the database only because an issue's come up.
Yeah, we do have a fairly a broad audience, and perhaps it would be apropos at this point to sort of say that when you are using WordPress, what a database is. And really WordPress comes in two parts, and one is the files that you upload to your server. And if you download WordPress, you are downloading the files, and they're all of the the PHP files and so on, and JavaScript and whatever else it might be, and you upload those to your server. But that by itself would be completely useless if you tried to use a WordPress website where there was no connection to a database. Literally nothing would happen. And so upon installing WordPress for the first time, you are asked to create and provide access to WordPress to a database. And it's maybe that you've never done this before. And essentially, most web hosts will create unlimited amounts often of databases for you, and it's got a username and a password and a user, and you supply those to WordPress, and suddenly it can start storing things that you would like to be maintained from session to session in it. But that's kind of where it becomes confusing, because what is it? What does the database look like? I mean, I can see WordPress. I can see what it looks like. It's got that black bar at the side, and the buttons all look like this. And there's I just get it. But having an insight in what a database looks like, I find that really difficult, because you never really get to see it. It's got no visual representation unless you use things like PHP MyAdmin, which provides a sort of, how to describe it, maybe like a spreadsheet way of viewing the database. But by itself, I mean, I know people who are quite happy with the command line interacting with the database. God, that terrifies me.
Yeah, it does me. I mean, my only interaction, again, is through PHP MyAdmin. And in fact, now I'm using cloud hosting. I have to install a plugin to be able to do that as well. So I installed PHP MyAdmin plugin so I can interact, because I don't have that through my management system.
Oh, and does that then provide the reliable UI that we're all used to? It just looks like PHP.
It does.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. Often that's provided by the web host, isn't it? You'll log into your control panel or whatever you want to call it, and there'll be a button there for PHP MyAdmin, which again is slightly confusing, because it's not really PHP, is it, that you're sort of administrating at that point? You're administrating the database. Anyway, yeah, that's what it is. WordPress is a database to store the stuff that you put in to WordPress, whatever that be, and files, which also stores the stuff that you might put in, like images and so on. But if you're typing in text and saving options and modifying things, that's all often getting saved into the database, which is a difficult thing to imagine.
Do you know what? I think in some ways, it seems to me that the way that most plugins and themes are marketed in WordPress these days are very much on speed. And I think if you're really taking a holistic look at speed, you can't really ignore the database then, because of the way that WordPress works, it's querying the database all the time. So to kind of ignore the querying of the database is to ignore a key part of the speed. Now, that might not show itself necessarily on the front end. We were talking about caching the last time we were talking, and that could disguise it. But really, it has a great impact, the number of queries that need to be made to your database, to the speed, certainly at the back end of WordPress.
Yeah, this is one of the things which people talk about all the time, isn't it? About if you install a multitude of unnecessary plugins, you're going to be slowing down your site. And on the face of it, it might seem, well, why would that matter? I'm not using those plugins most of the time. I've got this thing over here and I'm never using that. I've got this thing over here. But the way it works is that often those things are creating clutter in the database, and again straying into areas that I'm not really qualified to talk about, but my understanding is that the more clutter that there is in the database, the more difficult it is to get the data out that you're trying to pinpoint, and often things are being done that are unnecessary, that really don't need to be done, and in this case you might be adding 5 or 6 milliseconds here and a quarter of a second there and so on, and it all adds up.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're confused still, aren't we? And somebody might be able to tell us. But certainly in my experience with the 20 plus gigabyte multi-site that I had, I mean, it really gone so slow in the back. And it was there because it had in the database, the size of the database was huge. But what was being queried wasn't those things that were in the database. So we knew, as soon as I cleared it up, it got so much faster. And only recently, I was telling you, I was doing a bit of experimenting, loading up lots of different plugins and playing around with stuff. And I used a plugin called WP Reset, which will reset your database. But it also allows you, every time you install a new plugin, to automatically create a new snapshot of everything that's gone before.
Right.
So very quickly, this very simple site I was working on went to 8 gigabytes, and I just felt it getting so slow, and I forgot that I put the snapshots on, so I cleared them all up and just went quicker. Now, all of these snapshots, the stuff that's in the database here is not actually being used, but it was still slowing down the site.
Yeah, it would be really interesting if somebody who's got a deep understanding of how databases work, specifically in that case, can explain to us how it's possible that, in your case, these WP reset snapshots building up to 8 gigabytes, how on earth that slows things down. I suppose it's a bit like on a computer, isn't it? If you've got a full hard disk, that tends to slow things down. Presumably, it's just that the computer itself has to retrieve the bits and find its way amongst the detritus to get to the bit that it needs. And if there's more detritus that is not, that's getting in the way of what the database needs to give out, maybe that's what's cluttering it up. But on the face of it, it sounded like, well, those WP reset 8 gigabytes shouldn't in any way get in the way because they're not being used. But your experience is quite the opposite. So I would like to know the answer to that. I'm sure we could find it out with a quick Google, but maybe if somebody can let us know, that would save us a quick Google search.
It would, and how significant it is. So I think it's hard to. It's definitely worth looking into these things. I mean, something really only over the last couple of years. I get maybe when I first started getting serious about making websites, I used to try out a lot of forest themes, which were very heavy and bloated, and I didn't understand speed very much then. It was all about caching and what came out the front end. I didn't realize what was happening to my database and how many PHP functions needed to run was going to impact on it. And eventually I changed my approach. I went for more simple setups. But then I started to look at things, but I've kind of ignored that. And then as we moved into page builders, I've got back into the habit of using plugins to measure kind of database queries. So things like Query Monitor, and there's another really simple one, Usage DD, which just gives you some basic idea of how many queries are running with the plugins that you've got in your install. And I find that really helpful as I'm starting to build sites, just to see how bloated they could be getting.
Are those plugins useful? Because I've not got experience of either of those ones. Have those plugins, are they fairly intuitive from the get-go? So, for example, if somebody like me was to install it with very little familiarity with how this stuff really, really works, would I get a decent understanding right off the bat and understand what it is that was unnecessary?
Yeah, you would, definitely. I mean, Usage DD is really simple. All it does is put a little bar on the bottom of your site, even if you're in the page builder, which is quite nice, where it gives you 4 figures, and 2 of those are database related. They tell you how many database queries are being run on that page, whether it's the front end or the back end. Obviously, it's going to be different. And the front end, obviously, is the one you're going to worry about. But it also gives you the processing time of those databases. Now, they're not 100% accurate because they'll be impacted by your hosting and other things, but it gives you some indication of how things are changing. And I've known this for a long time, but I've ignored it until recently. There's this general rule of thumb, which I've seen mentioned before, but it's definitely mentioned on the repository page for Usage DD, where it's expected if you're running something like 150 queries on any particular page, you may have an issue with your theme or plugins.
Right.
And I find that quite fascinating because it's quite low, because you're going to, as soon as you put WordPress on, you're going to have 23 queries running anyway.
Right.
So you've not got a great deal of room. And I would say with most page builders, it's very easy to go over the 150.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's really interesting. Just give me the names of those ones again.
The Query Monitor. Probably the best.
I have used that one. I tell a lot.
You have used it, yeah.
But the other one I'd not come across. What's that one?
Oh, Usage DD.
Okay.
It's just like a cut down version of it. Really,
Right.
It just gives you the basic kind of speed parameters. Really,
Yeah.
It gives you a sort of load.
Yeah.
But the just looking at the database queries is really interesting.
Yeah, it's the sort of thing that I used to have religiously on my desktop. I would constantly be wanting to know what my computer was doing at any one moment in time in a sort of vain attempt to try and uninstall things that were slowing it down. The principle's the same. Just sort of get an idea of what's being used. And so have you made any decisions based upon the data that's given back to you about what you thought was, I don't know, let's say slowing it down in a way that justified uninstalling stuff, or you thought, well, there's a problem there, that plugin might have been poorly written, so I'll uninstall it and find an alternative? Anything like that?
Yeah, well, it's helped me to audition some things. I mean, certainly that and a little bit of looking in. That's sometimes when I do look into tables to see how many extra tables have been created by a plugin, and also whether that plugin clears up its mess when it's deactivated. That's also a key thing. But I tell you what, it's got more confusing for me recently. In fact, again, it was only last week or a few days ago, I think, that I contacted Short Pixel, because I spotted with using these that with Short Pixel on, it was adding something like 70 on my site, 70 plus back-end queries, and 50 on the front end for Short Pixel, which just optimizes images for me. I thought, what the heck? So I sent them a message saying, this worries me a little bit, but I will say also that I couldn't notice it in speed, and they've actually written a little article on it saying that actually you only get those if you've got the role that allows you to mess around with Short Pixels. So anybody else doesn't have that generated. So if I was in, say, as an editor or just a writer, an author, I wouldn't see those. But also that they were very quick. So what I've realized, of course, over the years is that queries, there are a lot more being made anyway in WordPress, but they're not all equal. Some of them are very efficient. Well, so Short Pixel didn't slow things down at all, really, as far as I could see.
Okay, that's a good point to notice as well. They're not all equal. The fact that some are, devilishly hard to achieve, and some might literally be just pulling some specific thing which is really quick to achieve. Yeah, that's a good point. Should we dwell on the cleaning up thing that you mentioned earlier? Because I think this is probably something that's really important in this discussion. The idea that if you install something and then at some later point you decide to remove or deactivate and then delete a particular plugin, the idea that it cleans itself up again. So again, just for those people who are not that sure, when you install a plugin, it will set up some aspect of the database. And you were saying to me before we started the call, increasingly it's setting up its own sort of custom tables, but often it might be putting things in metadata of things that are already in WordPress, let's just say it like that. And the hope would be that if you've decided upon not needing a particular plugin anymore, that it would go in and search for the things that it created and remove them, expunge them from the database. But that's not what you found, or what is always the case, is it?
No, it's not. And we were just talking before. We think that it would be nice if there was an extra option in WordPress, but probably not achievable. But yeah, with a lot of the plugins, I think, and there are other people out there I know who share the same beef with it. If there's a plugin that puts something in the database and doesn't clear itself up, it does annoy. And a lot of them, I think, do clean themselves up. Typically, things will stay in place if you've deactivated the plugin, but when you delete the plugin, it will then remove all its instances from the database. And some of them, something like WordFence, it is a setting which isn't on by default, but you can turn it on so when you deactivate, it will clear out all of its database. And I think that should always be there, but it's not with them all. And, there's no rules, are there, on what goes on the repository when it comes down to that kind of thing. So you would have to check for yourself.
Yeah, it does seem like a sensible default. And again, I suppose we're talking about the heritage of WordPress here, aren't we? When designing WordPress go back 15 years, there was probably no understanding at that point that people would be installing dozens and dozens of plugins. It was just a simple blogging platform, just to reiterate what everybody says about the origins of WordPress. And there was probably very little need for this kind of stuff. But I think that would be an interesting option to explore. Perhaps, again, somebody could illustrate to us why that's just stupidity. But having the option to deactivate, then delete the plugin, but maintain the database would be a nice option. But also the option, like you just mentioned with WordFence, to delete everything. And because there are no rules, my guess is that plugin authors or theme authors or whatever it might be would need to go the extra mile to create the code to go and successfully remove itself. And if that's not a requirement, perhaps that's a step too far for some of these authors.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, most people ignore their database. They don't worry about it, and it doesn't help you to sell your product, does it? Yeah. So, you've got to be a really good person, haven't you, to think about these things. But again, and maybe there aren't any rules that can ever apply to this, because it's one of my gripes when plugins don't clear up after themselves, but usually it's the type of plugin that won't be part of my mainstay. It'll be something that I'll try out or something, and I'll want to swap it with another version of the plugin that does the same thing. I probably will let off page builders for not clearing up after themselves.
Right. So how do you discover that a plugin has left traces of itself? So most people's experience is that you click deactivate and click delete and you wait for a few seconds and it's gone. Do you habitually go through like a testing site just to see what the residue is after you've done this with a plugin that you've tried out, and therefore make the decision, well, I shan't use that just for that reason alone?
Yeah, well, I've kind of picked up these things along the way. You hear people say about this, and then you go and check and you realize that your database has got bloated, and then I've taken a look. But I've started to make it a bit more of a routine that when I introduce a new plugin, I will use this WP reset. They're getting a lot of advertising, aren't they?
Yeah.
Because what it will do is, with the pro version anyway, it will give you a comparison. It will tell you what new tables have been added and taken away. So you do get to compare. So if I'm trying out some new themes and plugins, I'll get to find out through that. Yeah. So no, I don't do any of these things as routine. I've just kind of realized that certain plugins will leave stuff just when I've been looking in the database. So it's kind of random, but I've started to be a little bit more strict now. So I audition plugins, and I will use something like WP reset to check and reset, because the nice thing about the pro version of that one is it will give you what has changed in your database from one version to the next. So I can see if something what has changed in the database. But that's only a very recent thing that I started to look at that, and that's probably more because more recently there's more products I just kind of want to try out because I do some content, so it's not what your average user is going to do, but Yeah,
it does seem like the sort of thing that would be a good sales pitch on a website. I mean, maybe not to the majority of users because they really wouldn't be that interested, but for a proportion of users, especially people like yourself who are interested in this, it'd be a nice little bullet point in their sales pitch just to say, we uninstall we drop our tables or whatever it might be upon deactivation. We clean ourselves up. We're good custodians of your database, because that is a thing, and it wouldn't be something that would really draw me in, but it would you. So it might be the sort of difference between making a sale and not making a sale.
Yeah, well, I feel a lot of the marketing that goes on with speed at the moment tends to be a little bit misleading. They'll tend to focus on scores, really, speed scores and stuff like that, where a lot of what's really going to improve the performance is going to be, those kind of things, clearing up your database, the number of queries it does. But I guess the people who want to focus on speed probably are the ones who don't want to focus on that stuff, because often they're selling something which is all very whiz bang, does everything for you, and they tend to be the things that will run quite a lot of queries, so it's not in their interest. But I do think, but I mean, the long-standing WordPress professionals, the people who have been making plugins for free for the community for years, tend to do these things as good practice, don't they?
Yeah, you were mentioning earlier that that WordPress has sort of 23 queries that it runs to start with, and obviously they're kind of out of the box. There's nothing much you can do about that, and those are the tables that you get when you install WordPress. And you also mentioned, or maybe it was me that mentioned, that there seems to be a bit of a move recently toward storing data in tables specific to that plugin. Have you noticed that? Is that something that you've noticed? And does that make life easier? Are you able to track down those things to uninstall after the fact a lot more easily?
Yeah, so much easier, isn't it? If you know that this is a table related to that plugin, you can just delete it and be gone. If you happen to delve into your options table where almost everything goes in WordPress, it becomes a much trickier thing to do. I mean, it was very easy for me to use a plugin called Advanced Database Cleaner, which is I could use the free version on the repository to clean up my multi-stores because each of the individual sites had its own prefix.
Right.
To its database, so I could just find them and just I'm going to delete from here to here and get rid of it. So it was easy. So I avoid a lot of this, but yeah, it's so much easier if things are kept separately.
I'm not 100% sure if that's one of the primary reasons why this has been done. I imagine it's been done for ease of accessing the data and and so on. But it'd be interesting to know if there is that as part of the reason why people do it more and more, because you can just find the plugin X database table and then just remove it, safe in the knowledge that that is isolated from anything else, and you're not accidentally going to delete something. Because I think that's the fear that I've got with all of this stuff. And you mentioned WP reset a little while ago. Those kind of things, they do concern me a little bit because I'm trusting. Well, I don't know if, in your case, you take the information that comes out of WP Reset and then you click a button within the plugin to clean things up, or if then you go manually and hunt for the things that it's suggested and remove them yourself. But I just fear accidentally, because I'm so novice with all this sort of stuff, I fear accidentally clicking a button and removing something that I oughtn't to have removed, and then I'm stuck because I can't figure out the way back.
Yeah, but you've got backups, haven't you? And I think that's
true. Yeah, I do.
Yeah, that's how I've managed to go at things, because I don't know what I'm doing half the time. I should clarify something, actually. I said about the default 23 queries with WordPress. That is assuming at the moment that you've installed the default 2021 theme, which must be some of those queries as well. So probably if you weren't running a theme, it might be lower. I don't know.
Yeah, that is interesting, though. I do like the idea of having a plugin that sort of takes care of that for me. But again, just at the moment, it just concerns me that I'd delete something that I then, essentially I'm trying to save myself a bunch of time. Yes, I could restore from a backup, but I lose quarter of an hour, half an hour, whatever it might be, and most of the time I just can't cope with that. I just don't want to lose a quarter of an hour or half an hour, and so I firmly just carry on regardless with a polluted database, which is a bit stupid.
I don't understand what's going on actually with a lot of the plugins. I mean, there was a big update to the Yoast SEO plugin, version 14, where they changed the whole layout of their tables.
I remember that
as well.
Yeah.
But it wasn't, in the way that it seems to be something where they've got their own tables now. But this was much more complex about interacting with the REST API and endpoints. And at that point, when I'm reading the article, I've just completely blanked out. My eyes have defocused, and I look for words I understand, like at and the, and pretend I've read it.
There are.
I think a lot of,
Go on.
Yeah, that stuff's going on. I think it's going on in WooCommerce, because you'll notice now with an update, which is a bit of a pain, to be honest. If you update like we do with something like main WP, you think you've updated, but you haven't, because there's a WooCommerce database to update almost with every new major release.
Yeah, I've had that with a few plugins recently. I won't bore you, but one of them is a podcasting plugin, and they've obviously done something similar, and it required a simple update. And I remember doing a similar thing the other day as well, and I can't remember what plugin that was, but it said it needed to update something in the database. So in that situation, I just happily clicked yes, because I was in the site anyway. But I have no idea how long that nag was there, because I was updating it via main WP, and I logged in. I can't remember even why I logged in, but I logged in and there was this nag saying you need to update the database. And I did it, and it literally took the length of time it took me to blink to update the database. So I have no idea what it did. And the nag went away, and I thought, okay, is it still working? Right, move on. And again, it's just another example of my ignorance of these things. I don't even know what it was doing, just trusted it to do it. And yeah, but you're right, I would have missed a lot of those things had I just been using main WP to update every time. You've put a list in our show notes of a ton of tools. Now, I don't know if you've got experience with all of these, but you've got, I don't know, there must be a dozen tools in there that you've come across to manage databases with. Do you want to? Would it be worthwhile going through some of those, maybe?
Yeah, well, I've mentioned one of them, which is WP PHP My Admin, which if you don't have access to that through your hosting, you can get, and I've used that a few times. I think it's a little bit risky with security using that, but
okay.
And I mentioned Advanced Database Cleaner, which is really good for. I think that I've not used the Pro version, but I've managed to get away with that. That's really good if you need to delete certain things. There are some plugins, and I'll give you an example in Malcare where they do. So Malcare's got a free repository version for doing security scans. Really good deal. I think it's really excellent. But if you go up to their Pro version, which I have done, and you want to revert back for free, you have to go and find their tables to delete the information they've kept because you can't revert back. And the kind of things like that. And I've been able to do that with things like Advanced Database Cleaner. That allows me to get around and find stuff easily. Yeah, for me, I don't know if you use this at all because you're a main WP user. Yeah. The maintenance extension.
No, I don't. And so I saw that, and I know it exists, but I either don't have it installed on my install of main WP, or I simply ignore it. I want to know, what does it do?
Well, I trust that it does what I think it does, really. You set it to do a cleanup, an optimization every whatever time you set it. I set it for once a month, and it's supposed to go and optimize your tables, but I don't exactly know what that means. But it does clear up, and you can set this to however you want. So you can clear it to get rid of your deleted spam comments or your revisions or all of those things that could slow down your site. So I like that. It just clears stuff up once a month. But also,
okay. So it's cleaning up fairly benign stuff for you, stuff which is clearly a spam, a comment which is still left in spam is an easy win, isn't it, I suppose, and things like that, which are just data which you categorically don't need. That seems like an easy win. No, I must do that if that's the case. Does it do anything which gives you palpitations? Does it attempt to do things which might concern you?
No.
Just that.
I've only had to think about what clients might be doing, because if it's going to get rid of revisions, I don't know if they might be working on stuff. I've set that, not that say it keeps. I can't remember what I've set that on, actually, to be honest. But anyway, there's been no issues. But similarly, I've also started using WP Rocket, which does the same thing. You can set that as well to do a similar cleanup. So I've actually got twice a month. I've got WP Rocket doing one of them, and I've got main WP doing another one.
Oh, interesting. And obviously, WP Rocket is all about speed. So, you've got to assume that the cleaning of those unnecessary things is in some way impacting the speed. Otherwise, I don't suppose they'd be getting involved in it.
There is one other thing. We mentioned this before. We were talking about with GDPR. I think it's a really good thing for us, because a lot of the plugins that would leave stuff like Gravity Forms, in my case, now they've got settings where you can automatically clean up all the things that have been sent into you that go into the database. And it's true, I think, of many of the others as well. I think Ninja Forms, and I did spot as well at Fluent Forms, which you've started using, has also added this as well. So you can kind of clean up your database a bit there with those plugins.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing going forwards, because obviously privacy has become a concern in the last, let's say 4 or 5 years, in a way that it never was. And increasingly, everybody's sending data across the internet all the time, and there must be on many, many sites completely unnecessary data, personal data that you're holding about other people, unless you remove it. And so the cleaning of that database, or those database entries, it might not just be fun to do or worthwhile doing, it might be totally legal, a legal requirement to do it. So that's a really good point.
Yeah. I think it's helpful, and there's lots more plugins that need to do that wouldn't have done before. They would have just kept storing the data endlessly. So perhaps, other appointments type plugins, those kind of things, bookings. You can get them all to clear up now. So I think it's GDPR has been really good for clearing up databases in WordPress, I think, because now there's more options. The rest of the things you mentioned that I put on this list here are pretty much all doing the same thing. They're all various things on the repository. WP Optimize, WP Sweep. They are both plugins which pretty much do the same thing as my maintenance extension does.
Right.
They allow you to just clean up kind of transients and revisions and all of that kind of stuff.
Okay. I should probably say I will just copy and paste all of those links into the show notes, so that'll be all ready for you. You don't have, we're not making any claims for what they do or necessarily saying which are favourites, but I'll just put them all in and you can go and explore them. There's an awful lot on the repository, isn't there? There's loads. You've got 4 or 5 there. That's great.
Yeah, and I've tried them all over the time, and I can't tell them apart really. So,
okay.
In fact, Lester Gamers Chan, who's his name from when I first started using WordPress. I used his WP database manager, and he also does WP Sweep as well. So I'm not quite sure the difference between those two, but yeah.
Okay, well they're both there, and we'll mention them both. What have we missed?
Well, the other tool, which is a bit different, or there are another set of tools for managing your database, which are things like a better search and replace, or better search and replace, that's around as well, which allow you to, well, as it says, search and replace certain items in your database. Have you used this?
No, and I've definitely heard of it, but I'm struggling at this exact moment in time to think of a use case for it. What exactly are you trying to achieve by searching and replacing things in the database? Isn't that just changing one thing for another?
Yeah, well, it used to be part of my method for going live on a site. So I'd have it on a dev site, and then I'd want to. Right. So I'd transfer it over, and then I'd use better search and replace to just change the database to the new domain name.
Yeah.
But that's mostly how I used it. It started to fail on me, that. So these days I tend to use something else to just move the whole thing in one go. But yeah, there are those tools there as well.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I confess I don't use those. I mean, whenever I'm moving a site, I just log into PHPMyAdmin and just find that particular entry and strip out the dev or whatever it might be that's required. So yeah, that's the way I do it as well. That's there's a lot of links. Definitely go and check the show notes because David's compiled a fairly impressive list that he's tried over the years, and just sort of shows the difference between us because I've not really played with any of those whatsoever. Seemingly entirely happy to let my databases swell over the years. But to be fair to me, the sites that I've been building, they are largely static. The only changes that are in any way likely are either maybe stray comments, like you said, spam that somehow got in there, or I don't know, just little updates that have come through, things being updated, what have you. But in most cases, the sites are static, and once launched, they don't really change over time. So I don't really see the database growing. I often look at the stats of what the disk usage is. And in most cases, it's not really changing much over time. So I'm sort of fairly sanguine about that.
Yeah, I think the database now, it's only that I'm looking at what fills it up quickly because I do notice that speed difference. There is one other thing we didn't mention here because you've got two options, haven't you, for WordPress? You can either go the MySQL way or you can go with Maria Database.
Yes, I've always selected MySQL. My understanding is that there are benefits to using MariaDB, but I've never really used that. Well, yeah, and largely my impediment to doing it is because it's just what I'm used to. I'm used to installing MySQL and I'm familiar with it, and so I haven't really changed. But so you say speed. Have you got experience with trying it and getting benefits from it?
No. Well, I have tried it. And in fact, with some hosts, it's easy to swap. I think Cloudways allows you one clicks to swap over from one to the other. And I have definitely transferred from one to the other through different hosting without any problem. So that's quite a nice thing. Only a small little issue, which may have just been nothing to do with changing the databases that I experienced. So you can go from one to the other, but apparently Maria database benefits on the speed. It comes later and it's more performant, but I think MySQL is this kind of safer bet. It's been around a longer time, hasn't it? It's got more people behind it.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see over time which one takes the lead. Is MariaDB sort of a fork of MySQL? Do you know?
I'm going to go into making up stuff now, but as I understand it, as I remember, the people who set up MariaDB were the people who started off MySQL.
Okay.
So yes, they just branched off and did this, or it's some other people who started that.
Yeah,
that's my understanding.
Okay, yet again, a clarion call for anybody who's listening to this who would like to tell us what we should have known before we started recording this podcast would be. It'd be most welcome. I'd be interested to know what the reason for that is. I'm sure there is a reason. I don't suppose you'd fork an open source project unless there was actually a purpose.
Yeah.
But there we go. Have we covered it? Have you said everything you wanted to say? Yeah, I think so. That was a lot.
There was one other thing I'll just throw in there quickly, because I've experienced this, and you can host your database somewhere else independently.
Oh, yeah.
And I've always wondered about this, because we were with a host who did that, and I'd love to, really, it's just a question out there for anybody who could tell me the benefits. I saw the negative side of it, because what I found is that I would use the kind of tools I would to check whether a site was running live, and it would say it is, but in fact, with caching, it was an illusion. The database server had gone down, and I didn't know that people couldn't contact us. So I've only seen the negative of separating the hosting of the database and the files. But
Right.
I'd love to know.
The only time I've ever really played with that, but I know that a lot of people do because of speed benefits and dedicated infrastructure for databases as opposed to files. The only time I've ever done that is when I'm moving a site and I keep the database somewhere, or move the database first and then make sure that it's all connected, then move the files and make sure that that's all connected and so on. But I haven't really any benefit. But I know for things like Amazon and what have you, you can have a different location, but I'm just on sort of more traditional normal hosting where the host takes control of all of it and not setting things up separately.
I think you've answered my question. I think in circumstances perhaps with really heavy use WooCommerce or something, there might be a real benefit to giving yourself some
Yeah, that's a guess. I don't know. But again, there you go, for the 50th time in this podcast. Let us know what we already should have known. So there we go. I think we've done it. Databases are done. We've got E in a couple of weeks. Do we know what E is? Let's whet the appetites of everybody.
It's for ecstasy, you were suggesting earlier.
yes. E is for ecstasy.
No, it's for e-commerce.
Ah, yes. Again, another subject of which I am completely unfamiliar. So join us in 2 weeks' time when David will talk about e-commerce and I'll just tag along for the ride. Now, that was a good debate. Thank you. Not a debate. That was a good discussion. I enjoyed that. Thanks, David.
I did. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Well, I hope that you enjoyed that. Always very nice chatting to David about these things, and I'm sure you can agree this week we really did excel ourselves with our ignorance. It's a subject for which we really hold our hands up and say we don't know an awful lot about, but it's nice to discuss it. We air the things that we've used to make it slightly easier to interact with the database. If you've got any thoughts on it, please head over to wpbuilds.com, find episode number 216 and post a comment there, or head over to the Facebook group, which is wpbuilds.com/Facebook, and you could put a comment in there. Let us know what you think. The WP Builds podcast is brought to you today by A/B Split Test. Do you want to set up your A/B Split Test in record time? The new A/B Split Test plugin for WordPress will have you up and running in a couple of minutes. Use your existing pages and test anything against anything else. Buttons, images, headers, rows, anything. And the best part is it works with Elementor, Beaver Builder and the WordPress block editor. Check it out and get a free demo at absplittest.com. Okay, we will be back next week for another podcast episode. This time it will be an interview. On Monday we have the live, wpbuilds.com/live. It's called This Week in WordPress. Join us, you might enjoy it. But if we don't see you between now and then, I hope you stay safe and have a good week. I'm going to fade in some very cheesy dance music, and I'm going to say bye-bye for now.